I thought it was just an old map, just a piece of forgotten history, gathering dust in a box no one ever touched. A relic from a time long gone, tucked away with old family mementos, memories of people I never knew. I didn't think much of it at first. To be honest, I thought it was just something from my father's past, a little memento he had kept over the years. Something he'd found on one of his own adventures, maybe tucked in a drawer, a forgotten corner of our house. But what I didn't realize, what I couldn't possibly have understood at that time, was that this map was never meant to be found. You see, it wasn't the kind of map you'd find in a textbook or a tourist guide. No, this wasn't a map to some exotic place or a long-forgotten treasure buried beneath the earth. It was different. The paper felt strange, almost like it had lived 100 lives before I even laid eyes on it. The ink was faded, but it wasn't just time that had worn it down. It looked like something else had left its mark on this map, something that had been there long before my hands ever touched it. When I first unrolled it, I thought I was seeing things. There were symbols and markings that didn't make sense, places that didn't exist anymore, if they had ever existed at all. I could feel the weight of it, as if the map itself was holding something back, something it wasn't ready to show me. It seemed innocent enough at first glance, just an old paper, a few lines, some worn edges. But as I stared at it longer, I started to feel a presence, like there was something watching me, something waiting. I tried to ignore it. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that the thrill of discovery was clouding my judgment. But that voice inside, the one that nags you when you're about to make a mistake, it wouldn't leave me alone. Something about that map wasn't right. It called to me, pulled at me, a low, insistent pull that I couldn't shake. And before I knew it, I had already begun following the lines, tracing the path it showed me. At first, I didn't realize what I was doing. It was like the map had taken control of my hands. I found myself planning a trip, a journey to a place I had never heard of, to a location that didn't exist on any other map. I thought I was just looking for an adventure, a little mystery to break the monotony of life. But as I gathered my things, as I packed for the journey, something inside me started to change. I started to feel a sense of dread, a gnawing discomfort that grew stronger with each passing day. I wish I had turned back. I wish I had never followed that map. But by the time I realized what I was about to step into, it was too late. I had already left. The road had already begun to pull me in. And when I arrived, when I finally stepped foot in the place the map had led me to, I knew immediately that I had made a terrible mistake. I had expected a place that was forgotten. What I found was something far worse. A place that had been buried for a reason. A place where something waited in the dark. Something that wasn't ready to be disturbed. I thought I could handle it. I thought I could outsmart whatever dark thing had left that map behind. But the moment I crossed into that place, everything changed. The air turned colder, heavier, as if the very ground beneath my feet was watching me. And that's when I knew. There are some things you can't outrun, some things that can't be ignored. You might think I'm exaggerating. You might think that a map is just a map, a piece of paper that leads to some forgotten, overgrown corner of the world. But I assure you, I'm not exaggerating. What I found wasn't just an old abandoned house, a forgotten cabin, or some strange rock formation hidden away in the woods. What I found was a doorway into something I never should have seen, a place that was never meant to be discovered, a place where the shadows know your name and the walls whisper things you don't want to hear. I've told myself it was just a map, that it was just a simple relic, something ancient and forgotten, no different from any other artifact. But it wasn't. It was a warning, a trap, and I fell right into it. I wish I had never found it. I wish I had never unrolled that map. But now I can't escape what it led me to, and I'll never be the same. I wasn't looking for anything when I found the map. That's the truth. I wasn't searching for adventure or mystery. In fact, I was running away from everything. The death of my father, it broke me. There's no easy way to say that. It tore through me like a cold wind, leaving nothing but an empty space where warmth used to be. He was everything to me. He was the reason I traveled, the reason I pushed myself to explore, to learn. His stories were my foundation, the thing that held me together. But when he was gone, everything crumbled, and I didn't know how to pick up the pieces. It wasn't just grief, it was loneliness. A kind of loneliness that seeps into your bones and clings to you like a shadow that never lets you go. Everyone around me told me to move on. They said time would heal the wounds, that I'd find my way. But I couldn't. I couldn't move forward. And so I began to pull away from everything, from friends, from work, from my own life. I was stuck, and that's when I decided to go through his things. My father's belongings, old boxes, stacks of papers, half-finished projects, had been sitting untouched for months. I don't know why I finally decided to go through them that day, but it felt like the right time. Like maybe I'd find something that would explain the silence, the void he left behind. When I found the map, I didn't think much of it at first. It was wrapped in old leather, tied with a fraying string. The kind of thing you'd expect to find in an attic, tucked away among forgotten trinkets. I thought it was just another one of my father's little keepsakes, something he had picked up on one of his trips. You see, my father had been an explorer, an adventurer in his own right, but he never talked much about it. He wasn't the type to boast or share stories. I suppose in some ways he wanted to keep those parts of his life to himself. But I always admired that about him, the quiet strength, the mystery. And now that he was gone, I found myself craving to know more about the man I'd always looked up to, and so I unwrapped the leather and I spread the map out on the table. It wasn't the map itself that grabbed my attention at first. It was the way it seemed to pulse in my hands. It felt alive. I know that sounds crazy, but that's the only way I can describe it. It was as if the map was calling to me, pulling me in. Maybe it was my mind, maybe it was the grief, but there was something unmistakably strange about it. The map didn't just show places, it showed locations that weren't on any modern map, and some of the places marked on it weren't even places I recognized. One symbol in particular stood out to me, a small, curved line with what looked like an eye at the end of it. It was drawn in a way that seemed almost unnatural. I can't explain it, but it made my stomach churn. Something about it felt wrong. I wanted to push it away, forget it ever existed, but I didn't. I suppose in some way I needed to find something to fill the emptiness inside me. My father had lived a life full of discovery, of excitement, and now he was gone, and I was left with nothing but memories and unanswered questions. The map, it offered me something. It offered me the chance to be close to him again, even if only in a way I couldn't fully understand at the time. And so, without thinking, I started tracing the lines on the map with my finger, as if I could somehow unlock the secret my father had kept hidden all these years. I don't know what I expected. Maybe I thought I'd find some hidden treasure or an old, forgotten story that would make me feel closer to him. Maybe I thought it would bring me peace. But I wasn't prepared for what came next. I wasn't prepared for the feeling that started to creep over me. The more I looked at the map, the more I felt something shift in the room. The air grew heavier, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I tried to brush it off as just my imagination, but it didn't feel like imagination. It felt like I was being watched. Maybe it was just grief. Maybe I was losing myself in some fantasy, some story to avoid the pain. But then I saw something I hadn't noticed before, something that shouldn't have been there. A small, faint marking on the edge of the map, a warning written in what looked like faded ink. But it wasn't a warning meant for anyone else. It was meant for me. And that's when I realized I wasn't just holding a map. I was holding a key to something that had been waiting for me, waiting for the right time, the right person to come along. And once I started down that path, there was no going back. I had no idea what I was about to uncover, no idea how deeply the shadows had been waiting for me to find them. I should have walked away then. I should have burned the map and never looked back. But I didn't. And in the days that followed, as I found myself obsessed with it, I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just my father's map. It felt like it was mine now. Like it was waiting for me to finish something he never could. And that thought kept me up at night, made my heart race when I closed my eyes. I didn't know it at the time, but that map, those symbols, had already started to change me. And soon I would learn just how much I didn't understand about the place it led me to. I can't explain why, but when I first touched the leather wrapping, something inside me stirred, almost like a warning, faint but unmistakable. The leather was cracked and dry, like it hadn't been moved in years. As I untied the string, the air in the room seemed to shift. It was subtle, but I could feel it, almost as if the space around me had gotten colder, or maybe the stillness had grown thicker. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I know that it was the first sign, the first hint that I was holding something far more dangerous than a mere piece of old paper. As I unwrapped the map, the scent hit me. It wasn't just the musty smell of old paper or dust. There was something heavier in the air, something ancient, like the smell of old wood, damp earth, and something else I can't quite describe. It wasn't pleasant, but my fingers trembled as I unfolded the map, despite myself. I couldn't help it. The paper was thick, rough against my fingertips, and as I spread it out on the table, the edges crackled, almost too loudly in the silence of the room. At first glance, it didn't seem like anything special. Just a map, you know? A faded, weathered piece of parchment with lines and shapes that might have once meant something, but now they were just blurry smudges. There were no names of places I recognized, no cities, no landmarks that rang a bell. Just strange, winding paths and cryptic symbols that twisted in on themselves like they were trying to hide their true meaning. The ink was faded to the point where it seemed almost impossible to make sense of it, and yet I couldn't stop staring at it. I felt like I was being pulled into it, as if the map was calling to me, demanding my attention. I ran my fingers over the map, tracing the edges of the paths. My skin prickled as I did, like I was touching something that shouldn't be touched, something that was waiting for me to make the wrong move. As I moved along the jagged lines, I stopped at one point, a dark, inked symbol, almost like a circle with strange runes inside. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop staring at it. I felt my breath catch in my throat. There was something about that symbol, something that seemed to pulse or throb beneath my touch. It was as if the map wasn't just ink on paper. It felt alive, and when I ran my finger over it, that's when I felt it. A coldness, like a rush of icy air that swept over me from nowhere, chilling my skin, sinking deep into my bones. I tried to ignore it. I convinced myself it was just a draft, or my imagination getting the better of me. But the cold didn't go away. It clung to me, wrapping around me like a wet cloth, heavy and suffocating. My heart started to race, my palms started to sweat, and I could hear the sound of my own breath growing louder in my ears. That cold. It wasn't just physical. It felt like something else was there with me. Something waiting. And then I noticed something else. In the corner of the map, barely visible beneath the faded ink, was a word. I had to squint to see it, but it was there, etched so faintly that it almost seemed like it had been added long after the rest of the map. A single word, beware. I froze. I thought it was a coincidence. A simple warning, maybe added by someone who had been handling the map before me. But as I looked closer, I realized the word was written differently than the rest. The ink was darker, richer, as though it had been written with urgency, almost like someone was begging me to stop looking. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. Something in me refused to let go. I had to know what this was. I had to understand why it felt like the map was pulling me into its depths, like it was waiting for me to follow its paths. As I unfolded the last part of the map, the sensation grew stronger. My hands shook, my breath caught in my throat, and for the first time I felt like I was not alone in that room. And that's when I heard it, a noise, a soft, rustling sound, almost like paper being disturbed. But there was no wind, no draft, the room was still. I looked around, heart pounding, but there was nothing, no one. It was then that I realized I wasn't just holding a map. This wasn't a relic from the past. This was a map to something far worse than I could have ever imagined. I should have stopped there. I should have put the map back in its place and never looked at it again. But something kept me from doing that. Maybe it was my grief. Maybe it was my need for something, anything, to fill the emptiness. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it go. That's when I made the decision. I had to follow the map. I had to see where it would lead. And I didn't know then, but I was already too deep into something that would change everything. At first, I thought it was nothing, just a curious find. But something about that map, it stayed with me. Late at night, when the world was quiet and my thoughts began to wander, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept turning it over in my mind, those strange markings, the faint, impossible-to-decipher lines. And the more I thought about it, the more it felt like something was pulling me in. Like the map was calling to me, beckoning me to uncover its secrets. But why? Why this map? Why now? I told myself it was just the stress, the grief, that I was looking for something to fill the emptiness inside me, to give me purpose again. After all, what harm could there be in studying a map? I thought it was just a piece of the past, old, forgotten, lost to time. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I could feel it. It wasn't just a map. It was something else, something that had been waiting for me. Every night, I'd pull it out again. My eyes traced the edges of the map, skimming over the twisted paths, the lines that seemed to move when I wasn't looking. The symbols, they didn't make any sense. Not at first, but the more I looked, the more they seemed to form a pattern, a hidden language. I couldn't tell you why, but I became obsessed. The more I studied it, the clearer the call became. It wasn't a mere curiosity anymore. It was like a hunger, something deep inside me growing stronger with every passing hour. I started researching. Hours and hours spent digging through old archives, books, and websites, trying to find anything that could make sense of the map. But there was nothing. Nothing about the places marked on it, nothing about the cryptic symbols. It was as though the map itself didn't belong in this world. And yet I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it go. I began to notice things, strange things. Little by little, I'd catch glimpses of movement in the corner of my eye. At first, I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the shadows grew darker, more real. And the more I looked at the map, the more those symbols seemed to shift. I remember waking up one night, a cold sweat on my forehead, staring at the map that I'd left on my desk the night before. But something was different. There was a new symbol, just a tiny dot in the corner of one of the paths, barely visible but unmistakable. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever it wasn't something I could ignore. I tried to push it out of my mind, but no matter how hard I tried to sleep, no matter how many times I told myself it was just a map, the feeling never went away. It was like it was always there, lingering just beneath the surface, waiting for me to take the next step. That night, I made my decision. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to follow the map, that I had to go where it led, even though every part of me screamed that it was a mistake. What was I even looking for? What was it that I hoped to find? I couldn't answer that. I couldn't put it into words, but I knew I had to go. Something inside me pushed me forward, and as ridiculous as it seemed, as dangerous as it felt, I knew that there was no turning back now. I began to prepare. I packed my bag with the essentials: water, a flashlight, some food, a few first aid supplies. But the more I packed, the more I felt like I was preparing for something different, something I couldn't quite name. As I looked over the map again, I started checking coordinates, marking routes, tracing the paths with my fingers. But I didn't feel like I was planning a hike or an adventure. It felt more like I was drawing closer to something waiting for me, something that had been waiting for a long time. And then As I was about to step out the door, I saw it again. That same tiny symbol. The one that had appeared the night before. Only this time it was bigger, darker, more defined, and it seemed to pulse like it was alive, like it was watching me. I don't know how to explain it, but I felt it, the pull. And I realized then, whatever this was, it was never meant to be understood. I wasn't meant to find this map, but I had. And now I was already too far in, too far to turn back. I stepped outside, the map still heavy in my hands, and I knew, no matter how strange or impossible it all seemed, I had crossed a line. Whatever was out there, waiting for me, was no longer just a curiosity. It had become a part of me, and I had no choice but to follow it, wherever it would lead. That night, I set out to follow the map, but I had no idea what I was about to face, no idea what would happen next. I can't explain what it was that made me finally pick up the map and decide to go. But one night, in the quiet of my apartment, with the walls closing in on me, I knew what I had to do. The map had called to me for too long, its strange allure more powerful than the gnawing doubts in my mind. Maybe I was looking for a distraction from the pain. Or maybe something in me already knew the journey would change everything. Whatever it was, the decision was made. I packed a bag, just the essentials, some food, water, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and of course the map. I thought about taking a compass, but I stopped myself. Something about that didn't feel right. I didn't want to rely on anything else. I needed to trust the map. I wanted to follow it exactly, no deviations. And so, with nothing more than a sense of unease and an almost desperate sense of curiosity, I left. I drove for hours, the road stretching out before me, endless and straight. The hum of the engine was the only sound that kept me company, but even that seemed to fade into the background. The world outside the car was silent, unnaturally silent. As I drove deeper into the wilderness, the landscape around me began to change. The trees seemed to grow taller, thicker, their trunks darker, like they were watching me. The further I went, the more everything felt wrong, like I was heading somewhere I shouldn't be. The world outside my car grew distant, like I was slowly drifting out of reality. My mind kept wandering, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I passed dilapidated buildings, old, abandoned structures that looked as if they hadn't been touched in decades. The windows were broken, the doors hanging off their hinges, and there was this lingering, decaying smell that clung to the air. It wasn't just the smell of rot. It was something heavier, something ancient. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I passed each building, the feeling that something was watching me growing stronger with each mile. The road grew narrower, the trees closer, their branches hanging over the car like twisted fingers. The shadows grew longer, even though it was still midday. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like the day was darkening around me. The further I went, the more it felt like I was driving into something. Something I couldn't understand, something that wanted me to come closer. The map was silent, as if it too had become a part of the landscape, leading me deeper into the woods. I wasn't just following the map anymore. No, I was being led. And I don't know if I was the one making the decisions anymore, or if something else had taken control. I looked at the map in my hands, my fingers tracing the lines once more. It didn't seem real, the way the paths curved in on themselves, the way the symbols seemed to shift under my gaze. But I had come too far. I had to finish it. I had to see it through. I didn't know how much time had passed, but the world outside my window began to feel thinner, like the air itself was holding its breath. And then, just as the thought crossed my mind that maybe I should turn around, I saw it. I pulled over, my heart racing. At first I thought it was just my imagination, but no, it was there, right in front of me. A tree. Or, at least it looked like a tree. But it wasn't like any tree I had ever seen before. The trunk was black, not just dark, but blackened, charred as though it had been scorched by something far more intense than fire. The branches twisted, curving in unnatural ways, and the leaves, they weren't leaves at all, but jagged, sharp-edged shapes, as if something had grown them deliberately, with no care for nature's order. It was wrong, terribly wrong. And there, just beyond the twisted branches, I saw something else, a shadow moving, flitting between the trees, almost too fast for my eyes to follow. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my breath caught in my chest. The shadow wasn't natural. It wasn't a trick of the light or my imagination. It was something alive, something waiting. I stared at the tree, frozen in place, my pulse pounding in my ears. I looked down at the map in my hands, and my stomach sank. That tree, it wasn't on the map, and neither were the things moving just beyond it. This wasn't just some random stop. It was part of the map, but I had never seen anything like this before. Something was wrong, so horribly wrong, and it was all I could do not to turn around and drive back, leave this place, and forget I had ever come. But I couldn't. I couldn't stop now. I had come this far, and I wasn't about to back down. My hand tightened around the map, and despite everything inside me screaming to leave, I knew there was no turning back. Not now. Not after everything that had already happened. Whatever this was, wherever this place was leading me, it was too late to turn around. I had to see it through. And that was my first mistake. At first, I told myself it was just nerves. I'd been driving for hours, deep into the wilderness, and the isolation was starting to get to me. There was nothing around but trees and the occasional abandoned shack, broken windows, collapsed roofs, remnants of places long forgotten. I passed through these places without a second thought, my eyes fixed on the road, the map, the next marker I needed to find. But the deeper I went, the more I felt something in the air. A change. It was subtle at first, like the air had thickened, almost like I was driving through a veil of something cold and oppressive. I don't know how to explain it, but the temperature dropped. Not gradually, like you'd expect in the evening, but suddenly. One minute, the warmth of the day clung to the air, and the next, it was as if winter had rolled in early. My breath fogged up the windshield. The trees around me, once quiet, began to sway, but not in a natural way. The wind didn't feel right. It wasn't a gentle breeze, but a sharp gust that rattled the branches, making them creak like old bones. I rolled the window down, hoping to get a breath of fresh air, but instead I was hit with the smell of damp earth and something else. Something foul. A sharp, acrid scent, like something had died and been left to rot, but I couldn't see what it was. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just tired, that maybe I'd been on the road too long. But then I heard it, the first sound that I couldn't explain away. At first, I thought it was the wind, or maybe an animal in the underbrush. But it wasn't. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate, the crunch of boots on dry leaves just behind me. My heart jumped. I looked in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone, or something, walking in the distance, but there was nothing, just the dark woods. I told myself it was my mind playing tricks, but when I looked ahead again, I heard it once more, the unmistakable sound of footsteps right behind me. I slammed my foot on the brake and jerked the wheel to the side, stopping the car by the side of the road. The engine sputtered to a halt, but the silence that followed was wrong. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that presses in on you, fills your ears with that dull ringing. I turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening. Nothing. Not a single bird, not a rustle of wind in the trees. But then I heard something else. A whisper. It was faint at first, like a soft murmur carried by the wind, but it didn't stop. It didn't make any sense. It was a voice, low and raspy, like it was coming from behind a thick wall. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew. I knew it wasn't meant for me to hear. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overtired. Maybe the isolation was messing with my head. But when I turned to look out the window, that's when I saw it. Or rather, I thought I saw it. In the corner of my vision, a shadow, a flicker of movement in the woods. It was quick, too quick to make out, but it was there. Something was watching me. I turned my head fully, heart racing, but nothing. Just the dark woods, empty, silent. I couldn't shake the feeling, though. The feeling that I wasn't alone. I started the car again, my hands trembling on the wheel, and pressed the gas, desperate to get moving, to get away from whatever it was. But the road ahead seemed to stretch longer than it should have, the trees pressing closer, their shadows more menacing. And then, just as I was about to take the next turn, I saw it again. Only this time it wasn't a shadow. It was a tree, a twisted, blackened tree that hadn't been there before. Its bark was charred, like it had been burned, but in a way that didn't make sense. It was bent unnaturally, its branches reaching toward the sky in jagged angles. The sight of it made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. I pulled over without thinking, the tires screeching against the gravel. My breath quickened as I looked at that tree, trying to understand what I was seeing. It wasn't on the map. There was no indication of it anywhere. No marker, no mention of a tree like that. But there it was, and as I stared at it, the feeling of being watched, it intensified. Something about the way it stood, like it was waiting for me, its twisted branches seeming to shift in the corners of my eyes. I couldn't look away. I didn't want to. But when I did turn my head to look away from the tree, I saw something else, something moving in the woods, something that shouldn't have been there. I turned around, but no one was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched. As the miles stretched on, so did the uncertainty. Every turn I took, every small path I followed that seemed to match the map, only led me further into this oppressive, silent world. It felt like the land itself had grown still, as though time was held in suspension. But there was something else, something worse than just the isolation, worse than the sense of wrongness that gnawed at my mind. It was the quiet. The deeper I went, the more the world seemed to grow quiet, like the sound itself was being swallowed up by something unseen. The wind, the birds, the rustling of the trees, they all faded into silence. And then I saw it, the place that was marked on the map. At first, I didn't want to believe it. I kept telling myself that there must have been some mistake, but no. There it was, standing at the end of the winding trail I had followed, a house, an old mansion, abandoned and decayed. I couldn't have been more wrong. This wasn't the treasure I had imagined, the lost temple or hidden ruins that might hold some ancient secret. No, this was something worse. This was the destination of the map. The house, it was unlike anything I had ever seen. The windows were dark, too dark. Even in the late afternoon light, they were pitch black, as if there was nothing inside. No reflection, no light at all. The door stood ajar, as if inviting me in, though every instinct in my body screamed to turn away. The air around the house was thick, the atmosphere heavy with a sense of something wrong. And the strangest thing, the whole place seemed to vibrate with an invisible force, an energy that tugged at my chest, pulling me closer despite the fear that gripped me. As I walked toward the mansion, my feet felt like they were moving through molasses. The ground beneath me seemed unnaturally soft, like I was sinking slightly with each step. The garden around the house was overgrown, wild, but there was something oddly orderly about it too, as though it had once been carefully tended to. And now, the wildness was just a facade. There were statues scattered throughout the yard, dilapidated and worn down by time. They were of figures, but not human figures. They had strange, misshapen faces, twisted bodies, and features that made my stomach churn. And the most unsettling part? The symbols etched into their stone surfaces, symbols that matched the ones on the map. I had no idea what I was stepping into. I reached the door of the mansion, and, against every instinct in my body, I pushed it open. It creaked loudly, protesting against my intrusion. Inside, the house was even worse than I could have imagined. The air was thick and stale, almost suffocating, and the dust that had settled in every corner seemed alive, swirling around like it was part of the house's very breath. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and the walls, cracked, peeling, and stained, seemed to close in on me with every step I took. But the worst part, the part I will never forget, was the sense of being watched. There was no one there, not a soul, but every inch of the house seemed to be alive with something. A presence, pressing in on me from all sides, urging me forward, as if the mansion itself was breathing. I could feel my pulse quicken. I could feel the coldness in my bones. The silence in the house was suffocating, almost as if even sound was afraid to exist within its walls. And then I stepped into the main room. That's when the air grew thick, suffocating. And that's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow in the corner of my vision, something moving, but when I looked closer, it wasn't a shadow at all. It was someone. Someone standing there, just out of reach. And they were watching me, not moving, not making a sound, but there was no mistaking it. Those eyes, cold and empty, locked onto mine, as though they had been waiting for me, waiting for someone like me. I had come for answers, but in that moment I realized I hadn't come for answers at all. I had come for something far worse, something the map had led me to, something it had been waiting for, and now there was no turning back. I don't know what I was expecting when I stepped inside the mansion. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing far too loudly in the stillness. The air inside was cold, unnaturally cold, like stepping into a place that had been abandoned for centuries. The first thing that hit me was the smell. Damp, like old mildew, mixed with something rotten, something decayed. My instincts told me to leave. They screamed at me to run, to get back in my car and drive far away, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something inside me, some deep, inexplicable pull, kept me rooted to the spot. As I stepped further into the mansion, the floorboards groaned under my weight. The house felt as though it was alive, like it was breathing, shifting. Every step I took, every movement in the dark corners of the house made me feel like something was watching me. I couldn't see it, but I could feel it. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I instinctively glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to find someone behind me. But no one was there. Just shadows. Thick, suffocating shadows that seemed to curl around the edges of my vision. I don't know how to explain it, but I could feel them moving, stretching, growing, as if the house itself was alive. It was like walking into the heart of something ancient and cursed. I thought I heard something. At first it was a rustle, just the sound of fabric shifting in the distance. But then it was a whisper, soft like the wind, but unmistakable. The hairs on the back of my neck rose, and my skin went cold as ice. I stopped in my tracks, straining to hear. The whisper came again, barely audible, but clear enough to send a shiver through my entire body. "Get out!" I froze, unable to move, my heart racing. I turned around quickly, hoping to see anything, something that would explain the voice. But the room was empty. The shadows danced along the walls, and the cold, damp air made my breath fog in front of me. No one was there. But the voice, it wasn't just a whisper, it was a command. And it felt like it came from the house itself, like the walls were alive, breathing, talking to me. I started walking again, but with each step, the house seemed to close in around me. The walls felt like they were pressing against me, and the floorboards creaked louder, like someone or something was following me, matching my every movement. I could almost feel the weight of unseen eyes on my back, even though I knew there was no one there. I felt the cold again, this time more intense, like a hand was brushing against my skin, cold as death itself. I spun around, but there was nothing. Nothing except the flickering of shadows, twisting and warping at the edges of my sight. Then I heard it. A door slammed. I turned in the direction of the sound, my heart pounding in my chest, but when I reached it, the door was open. The room beyond was empty, or at least I thought it was. I took a few tentative steps inside, the air thick and suffocating, and that's when I saw it. A shape, dark and amorphous, like a shadow that didn't belong. It flickered in the corner of my vision, barely there, but unmistakable. I froze. My breath caught in my throat as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person? A trick of the light? It moved, slowly, like it was reaching for me, crawling toward me in a way that no human being could. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze. I could feel the weight of its presence. The temperature dropped further, and the air became so thick, so heavy, I could barely breathe. My chest tightened, my pulse quickening, as I realized that whatever this thing was, it wasn't human. It was something else. something that had been waiting for me, waiting for anyone foolish enough to walk into this cursed place. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. Panic surged through me. I tried to push the door open, but it wouldn't budge. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the air thicker, heavier. And then I felt it. A cold hand. It touched my shoulder, just for a second, but it was enough. I whirled around, heart pounding in my ears, but there was nothing. No one, just the oppressive silence, the shadowy figures flickering in the corners of my eyes. I stumbled back, my legs unsteady, and that's when I saw it, a face, pressed against the window. At first, I thought it was some trick of the light, a reflection, but then I realized this was no reflection. This face, I recognized it. It was mine. But it couldn't be. It wasn't me. My own face, twisted, pale, staring back at me from the window, its eyes wide open in terror. And the worst part? It was smiling, a grin that I knew wasn't my own, that no human could ever make. I ran, but the house seemed to stretch out before me, endless, the walls alive, closing in with every step. I was being pulled deeper into the nightmare, and I knew, deep down, that there was no escape. Not from this place, not from whatever it was that had followed me here. And that's when I realized the map wasn't leading me to a place. It was leading me to a curse that had been waiting for someone like me, someone foolish enough to believe the secrets it hid. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. Whatever I had felt in the mansion before, those strange sensations, the oppressive weight of the shadows, had only been a prelude, a warning, perhaps, or a test. But now, as I moved deeper into the house, I could feel the change in the air. It was as if the entire mansion was holding its breath. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faintest creaking of the walls, the soft flutter of something moving in the distance, just out of sight. And that's when it happened. I turned a corner, my steps echoing in the hollow space, and that's when I saw it, the doorway at the end of the hall. It was different from the others. The wooden door stood ajar, but the air around it shimmered, not with light, but with a kind of unnatural presence. My heart pounded as I approached. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop myself. I pushed open the door, and the first thing I noticed was the temperature. It was colder, much colder than the rest of the house, a biting, unnatural cold that sank deep into my skin, making my bones ache. Inside, the room was dark, impossibly so. Even my flashlight couldn't pierce the thick shadows. I stepped forward, my breath coming in short, uneven bursts, and then I felt it. The unmistakable sensation of eyes on me, but not just any eyes. These were heavy, predatory. Something was watching me. Something ancient, something that had been waiting. I didn't dare turn around. My instincts told me that if I did, I wouldn't be able to turn back. But still, I moved, one step at a time, into the room. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a flicker, a distortion in the darkness. But then it came into focus, a figure, slowly materializing from the shadows. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long, stretched beyond what was natural. It didn't move, not at first. It just stood there, watching me, its presence suffocating the room. I couldn't make out its face, not at first, but I could feel it. The weight of its gaze, the malevolent force that hung in the air. The air thickened, closing in on me, making it harder to breathe, harder to think. Then, without warning, it moved. It was so fast, faster than anything should be. I couldn't even comprehend it. The room seemed to stretch and contract like it was alive, like the walls were closing in on me. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut in an instant. I yanked at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The darkness around me seemed to grow deeper, more suffocating. My heart raced, my breath short and shallow, and then I heard it, a low, guttural sound like a growl coming from the thing in the shadows. The air buzzed with a terrible energy. I could feel the ground beneath me tremble, like something was shifting beneath the house. I turned. The figure was no longer standing still. It moved with unnatural grace, slipping between the shadows like it was part of them. It had no face, at least none that I could make sense of. There was just darkness where its features should have been. But there were eyes, Two glowing, blood-red eyes, burning like embers in the night. They weren't just watching me, they were pulling at me, pulling me closer, as if I were a moth drawn to the flame. I backed up, desperate to find an escape, but the walls seemed to close in on me, pressing in from all sides. The floor beneath me groaned, like it was protesting every movement. I turned once more, my mind frantic, but the door was still locked. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was someone behind me. My skin prickled, my breath shallow, and that's when I felt it. A cold hand, ice cold, resting on my shoulder. The touch was so light, so soft, I almost thought it was my imagination. Almost. I spun around, but no one was there, nothing. Just the shadows creeping along the edges of the room. My heart thundered in my chest, and then out of the corner of my eye, I saw something. A face. A face in the window staring in at me, its features twisted and wrong. It wasn't just any face, it was mine. But it couldn't be. My face was twisted in agony, stretched in a scream, though I wasn't making a sound. My reflection, or whatever it was, smiled. A smile that didn't belong to me, a smile that was full of malice. I backed away from the window, my mind reeling, and then it spoke. The voice wasn't mine, but it came from the same mouth that had just smiled at me. A deep, guttural voice, twisted with malice. "You shouldn't have come," it whispered. "It's already too late." And that's when I knew. The map, the mansion, they weren't just leading me to something forgotten. They were leading me to something cursed. Something trapped here for eternity, and I had unwittingly become part of it. The walls of the mansion began to close in. The figure stepped forward, and as it did, the shadows deepened, twisting into shapes that didn't belong to the world I knew. The air was thick with an ancient, suffocating darkness, and I could feel the weight of something vast and terrible closing in on me. There was no escape, no way out, and in that moment, I realized the truth. The map hadn't led me to a forgotten treasure or an ancient mystery. It had led me to my own destruction, and there was no going back. I don't know how much time passed, hours, days. It felt like an eternity, but when I finally stumbled out of that house, I wasn't the same person who had walked in. The world outside was bright, too bright, and everything seemed distorted, like I was looking at it through a veil. The forest that had seemed so dense and suffocating now appeared vast but empty, almost hollow. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following me. But when I turned to look, there was nothing but trees and a never-ending stretch of dirt road. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it all, that maybe it had been a nightmare. But then I remembered the map, the cursed thing that had started it all. I couldn't escape it. I couldn't forget what I had seen. I never spoke of that night again, to anyone. Not a single person would believe me, and honestly, I didn't want them to. The fear, the terror, still clings to me. Even now, I can feel it, like a weight on my chest. Every night it comes back. The sound of the whispers, the coldness, the eyes that followed me through that mansion. I don't know what I encountered there, but I know it wasn't human. I know it wasn't anything from this world. There are some things that shouldn't be uncovered. Some maps, some secrets, should never be followed. Maybe this map was a warning. Maybe it was a trap. I don't know who made it or why, but I know one thing for sure. The mansion I found, the place it led me to, it wasn't just abandoned, it was cursed. And I was foolish enough to walk into it, thinking it was just a relic of the past. But it was more than that. It was waiting for me, waiting for someone like me. I've tried to move on. I've tried to forget what happened, to push it out of my mind. But there are nights when I wake up, drenched in sweat, and I hear the whispering again. Faint at first, but growing louder until it feels like it's right beside me. And sometimes, when I glance into the mirror, I swear I see something behind me. Something not quite right. And the map is gone now. Or at least, I thought it was. I haven't seen it in months. But sometimes I wake up to find it on my desk again, as if it's been placed there by invisible hands. The same map, the same markings, and that whispering, it never stops. Some things should remain buried. I've tried to move on, to forget, But the truth is, there are some things that once seen cannot be unseen. There are some places that, once you've stepped into them, leave a mark on your soul. That map, that house, whatever it was I uncovered, there's no running from it. Even now, in the quiet of my own home, I sometimes feel the pull, like it's calling to me again, tempting me to return. I've destroyed the map, or at least I think I have. But I know better now. These things, they don't just disappear. They wait, and they always come back. So if you ever find an old map, something that seems out of place, something that calls to you from the past, remember this story. Don't follow it. Don't go looking for what's hidden. Some things are meant to stay buried, no matter how strong the temptation is. Trust me, because once you open that door, once you step into that place, there's no going back. Who knows what you might find, and more importantly, who might be waiting for you when you do.